Lord, not all the tears we shed today are for those we lost along the way. Some tears are for those who dare to say, we must have lingered on the way. Tears for those who fought so brave and gave their lives, and for those of us who died inside. We had been in hell and did return. God's mercy will be shown to them who served so well and suffered long, they who are the humble in this land, and did proclaim freedom to all in God's domain. Guide us, dear Lord, in your great way, we who are not trampled on the way. The life of a paratrooper was not for the faint of heart. The airborne of World War II were tasked with missions only those with the willpower to punch death in the face could handle. Between jumping out of planes straight into enemy gunfire and surviving days behind enemy lines, the paratroopers would have one of the most dangerous jobs during the war. While their brave brothers in arms famously stormed the beaches of Normandy, the airborne was tasked with flying overhead past the German stronghold, parachuting down into the forest behind the beach during the dead of night, all while being shot at and shot down by enemy artillery and gunfire. Within the first 2 days, casualties would claim 50% of paratroopers, some 2,500 airborne casualties. Clearly, being a paratrooper was only for the courageous and the daring. While all these soldiers on D-Day braved one of the most horrific moments in history, there is one unit that stands out due to their unconventional attitude and daring mindset. The 1st Demolition Section of the Regimental Headquarters Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army, more commonly known as the Filthy 13. The Filthy 13 was the inspiration behind the novel and later the film The Dirty Dozen, which depicts a unit by the same name. Now, this then inspired an Italian movie called The Inglourious Basterds, which in turn both of these movies inspired the movie you may be more familiar with, Inglourious Basterds. Units famed for their lack of traditional military discipline and their fearlessness in battle, but they would always accomplish their mission, something they'd all share with the real-life Filthy 13. Now, regardless of the movie rabbit hole, let's look at the history of the unit. There were actually quite a few members of the Filthy 13, far more than 13, as you'll find out a lot of them would actually die or be injured as an unfortunate result of their many wartime exploits. There's too many to really introduce them all, so instead I'll introduce them whenever there is relevant context. The leader and perhaps the most recognizable name of the group was Jake McNiece. Sergeant McNiece's style of leadership is what gave the unit their iconic mentality and their signature look. It's with McNiece back in the United States where the story of the Filthy 13 truly begins. McNiece was an Oklahoma firefighter, which meant exemption from the war efforts abroad. However, due to a drunken brawl where he nearly beat a man to death and in a subsequent effort to flee from the police, McNiece volunteered as a paratrooper. McNiece liked the idea of being able to hop straight into the battle, close quarter combat, and have a bit less disciplinary measures. Tasks such as cleaning and close order drills seemed pointless to McNiece, who would later say he realized that these tasks taught discipline, something his lack of would cause many issues during his military service. McNiece didn't mind the combat, in fact he seemed to welcome it. He just didn't care to endure the chores of being in the military. As a paratrooper, he was taught to act without officers as due to the higher casualties, a paratrooper needed to be able to improvise and react accordingly. There was a much greater risk of being a paratrooper, sure, but McNiece valued the independence afforded to them. Being a paratrooper meant always being right in the midst of the action, a role most men could not stomach, but one a daredevil may find excitement in. With such a job came a strong chance you would not survive, as many paratroopers died before they could even pull their parachute cords. Still, this was the only role McNiece found appealing. However, there was an understandable uphill climb to even be accepted as a paratrooper. Still, this was the only role McNiece would even consider, and he would end up making the cut. McNiece was assigned to demolitions and would go through months of training in Georgia. McNiece started earning a reputation as early as basic training, within his first week, beating a mess sergeant over a stick of butter. Between getting in fights in the barracks, fighting officers, fighting military police, and disobeying orders, McNiece would be a regular at the stockade. The soldiers were assigned to 5-man tents, with no floor to shelter them from the muddy ground, making keeping things dry and clean nearly impossible. Still, McNiece's group apparently made no effort to do so at all, earning the nickname the Dirty Five. This original 5 had a reputation for staying dirty, staying drunk, and staying in trouble, their lack of discipline often finding them in the stockades. Now of these 5, 1 would be kicked out, 1 would be transferred to assist in the headquarters, and 2 would go on to be early members of the Filthy 13. Martin Max Majewski, a man known for being good at football and standing his ground in a fight, and Louis Lollop Lip, a large man known as one of the strongest around. Within the demolitions platoon was also another group known as the Warsaw 7, nicknamed for its members having Polish heritage. The Warsaw 7 and the Dirty Five quickly befriended one another. Joseph Joe Oleskiewicz would also go on to be a member of the Filthy 13. One of the members of the Warsaw 7 would actually die during a drill. When setting charges and laying wires, the wind caused the two lines to touch, causing its explosion, which according to Mcniece, blew his whole chest up. This untimely death would be just a bitter taste of the wartime tragedies to come. The two groups would combine, forming a demolition squad with Mcniece as their leader. So after months of training and getting in trouble, they were all sent out to England to prepare for the invasion. Mcniece, although himself undisciplined, was known to have complete control over his men. His unconventional methods would make him an infamous leader among the officers in command. It was while in England that the group would earn their Filthy 13 nickname, and the 13 that would jump on D-Day would be formed. The nickname was earned because during their stay in England, the group refused to bathe. Instead, they used their ration water to cook game that they had poached from the nearby area. The Filthy 13 lineup changed pretty much completely by the time they were deployed. Besides Mcniece, the only original members were Joe and Lollop. Majewski was transferred but would come back to the group later in the war. Whenever there was a soldier who a sergeant couldn't control, he would be transferred to Mcniece's unit, where there wasn't much discipline. Some of these new arrivals were John Peepnut Hale, Jack Hawkeye Wilmer, Robert Ragsman Cone, Roland Frenchy Baraboo, Charles Maul Darnell, perhaps the best name of the group, James Piccadilly Willie Green. There was also Charles Chuck Plata, George Gugu Radecka, and Jack Agnew. If you counted 12, not 13, that's because Brinsley Stroop was injured in a practice jump, making them down a man, although they would add another half dozen for the jump. The group didn't believe in following the rules of the military. They thought it was trivial. However, they all loved a good fight, and they were about to get one. Right before they boarded the planes to take them to Normandy, and half of them to an unfortunate death, the 13 donned their iconic look. Due to Mcniece's Native American heritage, he cut his hair into a mohawk and applied face paint. His men liked the look, so they cut their hair and applied the face paint too, and the iconic look would be born. The photos taken of them will go viral in the 1940s since, with the 13 becoming American icons. Their look perhaps made them appear crazy to their fellow soldiers and the Germans, but it also had a certain intimidation factor to it as well. Soldiers that weren't thrust into the fray, but instead ones that welcomed it, embracing the action. Jack Wilmer would be the only member to jump without a mohawk or face paint, as he wasn't a fan of the idea. Being a paratrooper was one of the most dangerous jobs of World War II, with a life expectancy that didn't expect you to make it through a second jump, and unfortunately, many wouldn't. All of the paratroopers had a mission they needed to accomplish once they landed. And with such a high fatality rate, improvisation and an ability to act on one's own accord without officers was crucial to get the mission accomplished, no matter what. The main objective of the 13,000 paratroopers on D-Day was to hold off German reinforcements and a counterattack on the beach. This was accomplished by seizing roads, bridges, and specific areas to immobilize the Germans. Every unit had a specific task. As demolitions, the Filthy 13's mission on D-Day was to parachute behind the German lines, locate 3 bridges, seize and control them, and if necessary, blow them up. Of course, as more often than not, things wouldn't go exactly as planned. One could only imagine how nerve-wracking it must have been to be in that plane flying over Normandy, to hear and feel the outside metal being pelted with enemy bullets, to see that red light flick on signaling your squad to stand and get ready to jump. When it changed to green, that was the signal to leap, flying right through enemy gunfire and into a zone crawling with German soldiers. One thing that a paratrooper's job can heavily rely on is the job of Pathfinders. A Pathfinder is essentially someone who jumps about half an hour prior to the paratroopers and marks the positions with visual and radar signals. This helps the pilots and the paratroopers know where they are going, identifying drop zones and guiding them along their mission. For many groups, including the Filthy 13s, the Pathfinders were either shot down or lost. Regardless, it meant the 13 were dropped in the wrong place and had to find their own way to the objective. As far as the 13's plane ride itself, it went as well as it could. They were not shot down and all of them were able to jump. However, due to James Piccadilly Willie Green's parachute being shot through the plane, it delayed some of their jumps, meaning the group was separated before they even hit the ground. Piccadilly Willie would be captured when he landed, being a POW, a prisoner of war, for the remainder of the conflict. He survived, but weighed just 82 pounds when he was released. When they landed, that was when the trouble really began. Half of the members would either be killed, wounded, or captured during the mission. As soon as they landed, they were all separated. Jack Wilmer would end up being picked up by another unit and assisting in their mission. Jake McNiece was immediately in the middle of the enemy with no Americans in sight. Within the first couple of hours that night, he found Lewis Lollipalip severely injured. Lollip had landed on a paved road and broke his back. He was in a delirious state, rambling about baseball and Bill Lee, something they were told to shout as they jumped from the plane. Unfortunately, Lollip would not survive. McNiece was alone for a few hours. He charged into a dugout expecting a German soldier to impale on his bayonet, but it was an American paratrooper. Together, rounding up a group of 10, including Jack Agnew, who would be the only Filthy 13 member who McNiece jumped with, to fight alongside him during the mission. They made their way through a German headquarters, gunning down groups of a dozen or so Germans at a time. Eventually, they would run into an American colonel. The colonel ordered McNiece and his unit to abandon their mission to secure the bridges, and to aid in a new objective, securing a perimeter. McNiece flat out ignored the order, instead leaving to fulfill the mission given to the Filthy 13. This is an example of McNiece's lack of discipline and disregard for commanding officers' orders, but also the sheer determination to complete the objective. McNiece and the makeshift group made their way to the first bridge, a smaller, wooden one, along the way losing and adding some men. They reached the bridge, put the explosive around it and blew it up, making their way to the next wooden bridge and doing the same. The third and largest bridge was the last target. Their objective was to hold it and only blow it up if necessary to prevent reinforcements to the beach. They set charges and defended the bridge as night gave way to morning. McNiece had taken off his clothes to dry and placed them on the ground next to him, which subsequently got hit with a mortar shell in what McNiece described as the most frightening part of the war for him. Sand was thrown in his eyes, his hand bloodied, and metal shrapnel in his face. They defended the bridge for days, with little to no food or water. Many of the group were killed by a German sniper who had them pinned down. Agnew managed to take him out. They continued to defend the bridge, at one point being bombed by the American Air Force, who believed the group had actually died and failed the mission. The planes would bomb and destroy the bridge, thus indirectly completing the mission. Those remaining would go on to kill a group of around 100 Germans and continue to clear out the area, having no bridge left to defend. On the 5th day, they would regroup and rest, having against all odds completed their mission. Many of the original 13 wouldn't see the others again. As stated earlier, Piccadilly Willie would be MIA and Lollip be KIA, but they were not the only casualties the Filthy 13 took. John Peepnuts Hale would be killed in action, as would George Gugu Radecka and Roland Frenchie Barabue. Ma Darnell would be taken as a prisoner of war. Initially, all that was discovered of Robert Ragsman Cohn was his dog tags. He was presumed dead, but actually had been taken prisoner. You see, back then for some reason, your religion was initialed onto your dog tag. P for Protestant, C for Catholic, H for Hebrew. Well, Cohn had an H, and he wisely ditched the dog tags before being taken prisoner. His story is actually a pretty interesting side note. He hid with a farmer for a couple of days, who then turned him over to the Germans. He was taken to a prison camp, and he, along with other American soldiers, were liberated by the Russians, whom they fought alongside with for a while, until he and another paratrooper decided to walk to the American lines. They made their way through Poland and Romania into Russia, were thrown in jail, released, and then sent to an American base. Cohn actually made another jump before he was discharged. None of the surviving Filthy 13 knew he was alive until he called McNiece in 2002. Anyway, all this left was McNiece, Womer, Agnew, Oleskovics, and Plauda as original members who would go on to fight another day. They would go on to help secure the nearby vital French town, Carentan. But for time's sake, we're going to fast forward a bit to their next jump. The Filthy 13 will be filled back up with replacements, with new members such as John Dewey and John Denty Moore. The group had taken many casualties during Operation Overlord on D-Day, but due to McNiece's relentless attitude, their mission was successful. The next major obstacle was Operation Market Garden. This mission involved paratroopers jumping into the Netherlands, or Holland. This was one of the largest airborne attacks in history. The end goal was to secure a part of the Rhine River, allowing invasion into northern Germany. That didn't happen, however some Dutch cities were liberated. In terms of the Filthy 13, their mission was to take the city of Eindhoven and once again secure bridges. Compared to the prior Normandy jump, this one consisted of fighting in streets and houses, and due to it being afternoon rather than night, soldiers could easily regroup after jumping. The Filthy 13 would parachute down into Holland, except Plauda, who had parachute issues and ended up not jumping, returning back with the plane. The paratroopers landed about 10 miles from the target city and were immediately surrounded by tanks. They lost a lot of men but were able to clear the area. They fought their way to the bridges, which they then captured, then moved on to the larger primary bridge, securing it too, and after about a day and a half of ceaseless combat, the city of Eindhoven was theirs. The unit then went on to hold the bridges for several days. It's here where we see another example of McNeece's lack of discipline when it came to following orders, and his intuition saving his and others' lives. While defending one of the bridges, they noticed German bombers coming in hot. McNiece told all the men to get out of the area. A lieutenant, believing the Germans would not bomb the bridge, ordered everyone to stay put, in their positions, threatening to court-martial anyone who left. McNiece didn't back down and got most of his men out of there, which was a wise decision as the Germans did actually bomb the bridge. Unfortunately, 2 sergeants were still trying to get the lieutenant to evacuate too, and they ended up dying as a result. The lieutenant survived. Later, while traveling, they would be ambushed by Germans along the road. They had to fight through houses, tanks, mortars, and just about everything to escape and advance forward. There weren't as many casualties in Holland as Normandy, but the Filthy 13 did lose Joe Leskovics, who died along the way. It wouldn't be until much later that the group would learn of his fate. He would be hit from a tank, leaving only his legs behind. McNiece and the group would actually go AWOL for a while, and when they returned to the base, found that the legend of the Filthy 13 was beginning to grow in American legends, as well as discontent within command, as their unconventional methods and lack of discipline became much more widely known outside of their regiment. For his experience, McNiece would often get promoted, but as soon as he would get promoted, he would be demoted back down to sergeant for his insubordination. Perhaps the one job more dangerous than being a paratrooper was being a Pathfinder. I mentioned these earlier. They jump before the paratroopers and set up markers to guide them to their objectives, afterwards joining in on the action. It's essentially being a paratrooper with even more added risk. It's said that 8 out of 10 Pathfinders would die, and thus, with the job being near suicidal, it wasn't assigned, but rather took volunteers. Naturally, there would be a shortage of paratroopers willing to gamble this hard with their lives. You probably see where I'm going with this. McNiece was asked to volunteer for what he believed was to basically get rid of him, as well as the early member of the unit, Majewski. McNiece would volunteer because he believed the job of the Pathfinders would soon disappear, with the war coming to a close, meaning this would be the last time he would have to jump. After McNiece volunteered, so would Majewski, and other members such as Jack Agnew and John Dewey. Now, as with everything in the story, things were never easy. The Filthy 13, now Pathfinders, would find themselves jumping into the Belgian town of Bastogne. However, this was during the Battle of the Bulge. This battle was one of the largest, bloodiest, and longest battles of the war. It was essentially the Germans trying to take the Allies by surprise, going on the offensive, the last of the German Blitzkrieg. It was a huge battle, and the new Pathfinders found themselves jumping right at the height of it. McNiece and company dropped right into the city of Bastogne, which was surrounded on all sides by Germans. Firefights would ensue and the group would remain within the city for days, holding off the Germans. They would help aid the trapped airborne in the city, getting much needed supplies to them. While Pathfinder fatalities were expected to be around 80%, of the 20 men that jumped, they lost only 1. They would remain in the city until the Germans retreated from the battle. McNiece would actually achieve the extremely rare feat of performing 4 combat jumps. Many were not expected to survive one. Near the end of the war, he and his group jumped into Prüm, Germany as Pathfinders, once again losing just 1 man out of 10. At this point, with the war all but won, they moved on into the Alps where Hitler's Eagle Nest and headquarters were. In addition to the other units, this was taken without much issue, and the group would finish out the war doing a lot of occupying with minor skirmishes, and return home to the States, but not without one last street brawl with the Paris locals. The remaining Filthy 13 would reunite for the first time in 1980, and afterwards McNiece, Jack Womer, and Jack Agnew would speak about their experiences. Agnew would die in 2008 at age 88. Womer would be the last living member of the group, dying in late 2013 at 96 years old. As for Jake McNiece, his military career was over after the war and he would work in the postal service for many decades, get married, and have 3 children. Later in his life, he began to speak much more openly and publicly about the Filthy 13's exploits, even touring the States to give speeches. Sergeant Jake McNiece would die at the age of 93 in January of 2013. The last of the Filthy 13 may be gone, but their legendary status as fearless paratroopers will live on. The group is seen as American heroes, perhaps not the most conventional nor the most disciplined, yet they always accomplished their mission and always fought for their brothers in arms. McNiece and the Filthy 13 didn't care about the rules, they didn't care about their image, the only focus was the mission and the soldier next to you. Now, for the purposes of time, I left a lot out, a lot of very interesting, gritty stuff. If you're interested in learning more about the Filthy 13, I'd suggest you read Jack Womer and Jake McNiece's autobiographies about their time in the military. Their accounts are the primary sources for this video, and I'd highly suggest them if you enjoyed this story. McNiece's book gives a great glimpse as to what the Filthy 13 was all about, and details their many wartime exploits. And believe me, it is a fascinating story. So I hope you enjoyed the story of the inspiration behind some of the most iconic wartime movies, the Filthy 13. Perhaps their mentality is best stated in one final closing quote. Jack Agnew once said, "We weren't murderers or anything. We just did a whole lot more than they asked us to do, and we were always getting in trouble for that." Thank you for watching.